Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. My name is Alan Fadling, and I invite you to listen to leadership conversations that will help you to develop healthy rhythms of rest and work, and to live fuller in friendship with God. I hope this podcast will help you to overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 222 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and I'm so glad you've joined me here. I'm hopeful that our time together will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Each week on the podcast, we have leadership conversations to help us lead better in the spirit of Jesus' unhurried way, the way of leadership that flows from a full soul instead of an empty one. Sometimes I'm talking with fellow authors, and sometimes I'm talking with leaders just like you who are learning to live and lead at the fruitful pace of grace and peace. Today, I'm sharing my conversation with Justin Whitmel Earley about his latest book, Habits of the Household. A few years ago, we shared a conversation about his first book, the award-winning Common Rule. You can go back to episode 72 to listen to that conversation. Specifically, his book extends his insights into a personal rule of life into how to cultivate a rule of life for a family. At the time he wrote the book, he and his wife, Lauren, had 3 young boys and another on the way. What he writes has plenty of insight for households of many different kinds. Holy habits extend from personal practice to community practice. Now, Justin Whitmel Earley is a writer, speaker, and a lawyer from Richmond, Virginia, and the author of the award-winning book on habits and spiritual formation, The Common Rule. But most of all, Justin is a dad who is married to Lauren and spends a lot of time wrestling his 4 young boys. Now, if you're a new listener, welcome to the podcast. If you find these episodes helpful, please follow, rate, and review, and be sure to share this podcast with your friends. Now, let's dive into my conversation with Justin Whitmel Earley. On today's Unhurried Living podcast, I'm pleased to have Justin Whitmel Earley, author of Habits of the Household. Justin, thanks so much for having this conversation.
You're so welcome. I am glad to be back, as we had a conversation a couple years ago.
That's right. Well, I think it was just a little more than 3 years ago that we had a chance to talk about your first book, The Common Rule, which has actually been among our more listened to episodes, which I'm really glad to say.
Oh, well, wonderful.
Yeah. And so what I'd love to do is, since this, I don't know if you'd call this a sequel, it seems very much related to what you wrote in A Common Rule. Talk a little bit about the journey to writing this second project.
Yeah, I guess we could start as I was saying, habits matter even in your family.
Yeah.
Actually, I joke with people. It seems that I'm 2 for 2 on books that come out of crisis, and readers or listeners who heard the first conversation will remember that the Common Rule really came out of my own anxiety and panic crisis as a young lawyer, and realizing that my habits were forming my whole life, including my spiritual life, far more than I ever knew or thought they were. And so, that led to a wonderful, incredible journey of really thinking through what a rule of life could contribute to an ordinary guy's like me day of lawyering and technology and busyness, etc. And it was a couple years into that journey, but after the book had been written, where I had a subsequent sort of epiphany crisis, I just realized that in the chaos of a home, raising young children, which is always chaos, no matter if you're doing that chaos well or poorly,
yes,
that in the chaos of that home, that was an area of formation too, and that all the thinking I had done on habits as spiritual formation needed to be applied there. And so this project really has come out of really kind of a stage 2 of, okay, what does this look like in the household?
I love that. I always think that a book that grows out of personal need, and especially maybe a little bit of crisis,
Yes.
maybe some of the best books, because I think they're real. They're not theoretical. You're not talking about, I think this would be a good idea. And I read these 17 books and they think it's a good idea too. I just think out of your own lived experience, you're sharing an important story.
Yeah. And this is that, which is, I guess, hopefully what you say, hopefully that helps because it's real and lived. But I also think it's just an important way to understand the book that, I don't write as an expert on families or as a counselor who has talked to many parents and many children. I write about like this, from a dad who before this podcast has been working as a lawyer all day. And, I got a call from my wife midday about how the kids are doing. And, my life as a lawyer, a father, a husband, and I write about it from the trenches, which I certainly hope helps people, but it is admittedly of like, I am processing this in real time with my boys who at the time of this conversation there's 4 of them and they're aged 3 to 10.
That's amazing. Well, I really enjoyed reading what you've written. And so in the book, you suggest that one of the most significant things about any household is what is considered to be normal. And I think that's just a simple but a profound insight. What's normal in our household? Can you say more about that?
Yeah. Well, a little more on my crisis epiphany to get there, how I came to that statement may help. So, I'm putting my boys to bed one night a few years ago. There were 3 of them then. And bedtime with our boys is kind of what you would expect. It's bathwater on the floor, naked escapees from bath. They wrestle a lot, including, right after bath, throwing board books, all this stuff. And I remember on this particular night, just kind of snapping into the shouting dad mode, or sometimes I call it the impotent general mode. No matter how loud I scream, it doesn't seem to matter. But, I just sort of started marshaling them to bed, yelling them to bed. And I quickly gave them a good night prayer and told them I loved them and shut the door. And I think what was so interesting about that night wasn't the irony that I felt in the hallway, which was, what do they think love means? I mean, I just yelled them to bed and then I'm like, I love you. So does God. The interesting about that night was that my epiphany that was, oh, this is normal. It just sort of hit me. And as this happens to people, I mean, and I think it's worth happening. You need your hallway moment or whatever room of the house it is. You need your moment of realizing, what is it like to live with you? What is your normal day to day? Because what your habits are, what your typical routine is, we could spiritualize it and then say, this is your rule of life, or this is your liturgy of existence. This is what it feels like to live with you. And that's, I think, where you start to open your eyes to the fact that your life with your family is not primarily those significant special moments where you said that thing you really meant to say and thought about saying. Those are good and meaningful. But your life is largely the 1,000 unnoticed habits that you went through on the course to get there. And my work on habits and the common rule came out in my heart and head that night. And I started thinking, I know that habits form us. I've done all this work researching and writing and thinking about it. Why have I not really thought really hard about how that affects my children? Because if I'm going to become my habits, and as it goes, our children become us, then my children, in a very significant sense, are becoming my habits or being formed by my own habits of the household. And it was my little crisis moment to think it's time to start thinking carefully about that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so important. You use the language of liturgies as another language for habit, I suppose.
Yes.
You could say. And you talked about reimagining household habits as gospel liturgies, because there's a whole lot of other liturgies that are awfully common in our culture. You mentioned liturgies of efficiency, or liturgies of impatience, or of hurry, or of frustration. Talk about gospel liturgies and how maybe there could be a new normal for us.
Yes, right. So the rest of that story, I think, introduces that topic well, because one way to understand what I was experiencing in the hallway. And of course, I didn't have words for it then, but like afterwards, in retrospect, you come up with this stuff. And, I could look back at those evenings and think, oh, okay, one way to express the spiritual importance of what's going on is to say, this is sort of a liturgy of anger. The way that I progress the evening and get it to its goal is by shouting and, threatening my children with anger. That's the way that I move life forward. When you put it like that, you realize, oh, that's the spiritual significance of living with these routines of frustration. And so one of the things that I worked through with my pastor because I called one of my pastors after this and just sort of was confessing and commiserating on, how difficult this was. And did he have any insights, and he recommended that I try a bedtime liturgy with the boys. And that, I wrote about and I thought about liturgies as habits as liturgies in the common rule. And so, what I did from there was I came up with this little question and answer that I would go through with them in the evening. And it was just super simple. One like this. I would say, do you see my eyes? And their answer is yes. And then I say, can you see that I see your eyes? And they say, yes. Then I say, do you know that I love you? They say, yes. Then I say, do you know that I love you no matter what bad things you do? They say, yes. Do you know that I love you no matter what good things you do? And they say, yes. And then I end with, who else loves you like that? And they say, God does. And I say, rest in that love. And now, like the first time you do this, right? The first time I came up with this, I forgot what I was going to say. They thought the eye thing was weird. They start poking my eyes. They don't know the right answers to those questions. Do I love you no matter what bad things you do? They're like, I don't think so. Doesn't feel. So there's an important caveat, as sentimental and special as that, back and forth might sound. No habit is normal until it is. And every
That's
important habit you'll ever introduce in your life, your church, your ministry, your family will feel kind of awkward at first. But
yes,
this is what, if families are anything, they're the place where weird things become normal, right? Your families can make weird things normal, and that's part of family culture. And that can work in our favor too. Really maybe awkwardly intentional moments like that actually can become normal, especially with little children. And so the neat moment for me was a couple nights after doing this, probably a week into it, one of my boys asked for their bedtime blessing. And we went through this exchange of God's unconditional love for us and how we hope that's reflected in the family. And that was the only thing that was different about that night, which is so important to emphasize. It was still a messy evening. I still felt my anger flaring, but we landed the plane, so to speak, with this really kind of special moment of exchanging the words of God's unconditional love for us, which reminded me, and hopefully in time them, that is the dominant fact of the household and this day. Not how well did I do in my parenting habits today, not how well did they do in their behavior today or something else, because both of us probably did pretty poorly. But the dominant fact of today, and this is why it has become a really meaningful habit for us, is to remind each other at the end of the day that God loves us no matter what. And that's where I get the idea of a gospel liturgy, and that is to take little pieces of the household like this, bedtime, and you can do it for mealtime, you can do it for moments of discipline, you can do it for snatches of conversation or waking rhythms, and you can just say, what would it look like to try to bend this moment towards the love of God for us and how the love of God affects blank, car rides, meal times, and of course, like Kuyper said, there's not a square inch of the universe over which Jesus doesn't say mine. There's not a square inch of your household that the gospel cannot reorient. And so for me, this became a project of thinking through, what would it look like to saturate the household in gospel liturgies? And far from being a arduous process of, I've got to work on everything and make everything right, it's been such a freeing and relaxing process to loosen the grip of anger and frustration and the other habits that are going to be there if you don't do anything else, because your life is formed in your default family histories and the current culture of American, norms, and to loosen the grip of those and allow the Lord to come in and say, what could this look like? I mean, to me, that's the definition of grace, that your today does not have to look like yesterday's rhythms. They can be new. They can be different. His mercies are new every morning. And it's really been a life-giving project.
I love that. And so one of the implications, even as I'm just listening to you, is, habits imply a kind of repetition.
Yes.
And sometimes we think repetitions can be bad, like, oh, well, we just do the same old thing over and over again.
Yeah.
The kids are masters of repetition, the whole do it again thing until you're about ready to throw
That's
up.
right.
They actually love
kids love habits.
Yeah.
They are made for them. And that's part of the that was a little bit, Alan, part of the realization that they are sponges for this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And we would do well to pay attention to them and actually help them by saying, you're going to get into some routine. So how about this one, So, yeah.
Totally. Well, and you mentioned grace. I love the idea that spiritual disciplines are rooted in grace, that
yes,
you're not trying to earn something. You're not trying to produce something. You're being receptive.
Right,
you're opening up opportunity. Your phrase was grooves of grace. I love that idea, especially as it relates to liturgies or habits. Say a little bit more about how the grace of God relates to our practices, our habits.
Yeah. I think I wrote that habits are like a rut. Yeah, it was funny. I remember this because a pastor called me later. He's like, I love that line. Do you remember when I told you that like 2 years ago in a conversation? I was like, oh no, I forgot to cite you. So
give you credit.
I'm doing it here. Father Dan Murata at Redeemer Anglican Church in Richmond, Virginia.
Full credit.
Described this to me, full credit one time. It's just, habits are like a rut. They're really, really easy to stay in.
Yes.
They're just really hard to get out of. And we know this so well when it comes to addiction and bad habits and bad routines. It's just like, oh my gosh, why do I keep doing this? But it's just important to take a moment to realize that there is there's something about the world, and something about our hearts that are like wagon wheels and ruts. We have grooves that we run in, right? But what's so and the important thing to take away from that is that habits have a destination. They take you somewhere, right? Just like it's easy for the wagon to go to this destination because there's a rut. And what's so important is to realize that while that is true, you are not stuck with the habits that you have now. You're not stuck with the addictions you have now. And that is because of grace. Okay. Yeah. So there is a God who can lift the wagon. There is a God who can not only lift the wagon, but can also give you a new and better rut. So a rut is not necessarily bad. It can be great when it's downhill leading to the place that you want to go and you don't have to do anything to get there. It's like you're on cruise control. And so I think I would urge us not to think of repetition or ruts necessarily as emotionless or by rote or having no passion. It is actually very possible to, and I believe this is just sanctification. It's very possible to start practicing the virtues of imitating and living like Christ. And there are grooves of grace that can happen there where, I think it was Dallas Willard who famously put it that Christianity of the gospel is not opposed to effort; it's opposed to earning. And so we shouldn't be thinking that, we're looking pretty good today because I'm running in the grooves of grace. No, grace pulled you out of that rut, and grace dug a new one, and grace is at the end of that rut. So life is all grace, but it's not opposed to effort. It's the idea that we should try. We should really rethink. I mean. It's kind of easy in the household to realize that children are at stake, right? So that should motivate us. I mean, your child is formed by your tone of voice. Your child is formed by the way you do or do not lift your gaze to them. Your child is formed by the way you do or do not hug them or say that you're proud of them. The ways that you do or do not kneel beside their bread or lean down into bed to pray with them. We could go on. Children, real image bearers of God, are at stake here, and it is worth our effort to try to rethink what does the household look like if it's reimagined in the gospel liturgies of grace. And there's so many practical places to go from there, but that's the heart of why we would talk about this at all.
Yeah. Well, so as I was reading, one of the themes, of course, we're the Unhurried Living podcast. So the challenge of hurry, I'd love for you to think out loud about whether there are particular practices or even just how it is that these gospel liturgies help address this particular challenge that I think is especially a big one, maybe especially for families. I think of this COVID season where things shut down and some families for a minute had like open space in their schedule.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
some of them were pretty uncomfortable with it, but some of them discovered they kind of like being together,
That's
How
right.
might these gospel liturgies help us open up space for what we care about?
There's actually, I think, a lot of practical examples here that you can see, if not primarily, at least significantly trying to combat hurry. So some of the ones that are my favorite to talk about, and anybody who looks at the book will see that the chapters progress in terms of these moments of the day, like waking, meal times, moments of discipline, screen time, and then we get to bedtime at the end. Yeah. But my original, example, a lot of that came from my desire to hurry out of bedtime, to hurry and get this part of my day done. Like, please go to sleep and shut the door so I can move on, And so some of that has been a leaning into that moment of bedtime, as in parenting is happening here. This bedtime is not for something for me to escape, but rather to realize a moment of formation is happening here. Likewise, meal times are a huge one. And we could go into the significance of eating together and the way that we try to pray and, express gratitude for the meal and ask questions. But even the fact of having a family dinner as a habit is 100%, in battle with hurry, right? Like, Absolutely. Are we going to make space in the family schedule to have a regular dinner together, even though we got soccer practice and band practice and this elders meeting and that, church meeting and this work after, to say that there's a non-negotiable, half an hour in our day where we're going to find time at the table is to reform your whole life,
Yes.
And that's what these things are meant to do. They're to say, okay, if I'm actually going to practice this habit of a family mealtime, I might have to change my sports schedule, or I might have to change my work schedule. And that's exactly the kind of things I want people wrestling with. It's not that everybody will look the same, but everybody needs to answer that question. And just one more example, and then you can decide if you want to dig into any of these. But I think discipline, moments of discipline, whether you have a toddler or a teenager, a big question that you're going to answer as a parent is, do I want to hurry through this by behavior management and just say time out, or you're grounded, or consequence here, like you're done, leave now? Or do I want to be a parent who disciples and leans into that moment and says, it is always an inconvenient moment to have to discipline. Like, there is never a moment where you're like, oh, I'm glad this happened now because I have time. No, right. You're always like, whether it's like you just found out what happened last night with their teenager because you found their phone text message chain or something, or whether you just, found your toddler breaking into the cookie jar. A parent always has a decision in those moments to just say, do I want to say, well, I was trying to head out the door, or we were trying to hurry onto this, but now I need to talk. I need to pull this boy or girl or, adolescent or baby aside and engage with them on what happened. Why did it happen? What were you thinking? What did you want to happen? What were you feeling? What did you think I was going to feel? All these things take time, because, and look, time is the medium that in which love happens. I mean, you can't love outside of like presence and time. So the idea that you're together for an extended moment, or maybe a series of extended moments, that is the medium where love happens. And that's where discipleship happens. And that's just discipline in the end is discipleship. So bedtime, meal times, moments of discipline, hurry will rob them all of significance.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. I love the way you talk about essentially our time is the currency for expressing love. I mean, we cannot love our families in a rush. We can't. Here, son and daughter, I've got 13 seconds for you. Here, just make the most right. of them.
And Alan, you were just telling me before we started the conversation about a 4-hour conversation you had with one of your sons, and I that gives me great joy just to think that hopefully what's ahead of me is years where my kids will lean into that time and actually want, as a father, for me to talk to them even when they're older for 4 hours. And that's love, that's where love happens.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Well, in one of your chapters, you address the question of screen time,
Indeed.
which I think is a big deal. I don't know what your life was like growing up as a little kid or a teenager. I grew up at a point where screens weren't. The only screen was, a television that you had to get up and turn a knob on it,
Right.
So screens didn't have much of a place in my formation, but man, my kids now are 20 somethings. Your kids are, sort of maybe 20 years behind that, 15 years behind that. And oh my goodness, screens are omnipresent.
They are.
And one of the things I loved a phrase your wife used, that this whole matter fighting over screens is a fight for formation.
Yes.
That is exactly right. Say more about that.
Yeah, she's wise. And
yes,
I note this in the chapter, but she really helped me frame this chapter, because I've done a lot of thinking about screens in my personal life and work life and to some extent in the home. But she is the one, as the stay-at-home parent at the moment, who's really leading them through the fight for screen time every day. And any parent, anybody knows this, right? So let's just make sure we're on the same page. We are all adolescents when it comes to screens, because the screens that we use now in the form that we're talking on and in the form that our phones have them are really about 12 or 13 years old. We're truly adolescents when it comes to understanding how to use screens. And I often remind people, and many do, this is not a new analogy, but the printing press overhauled the world for centuries after it was. It overhauled religion, it overhauled states, it overhauled education, everything. Changes in technology are not necessarily bad, but they are extraordinarily significant.
Yeah.
And what we are experiencing in our screen, revolution is something that's going to be far more powerful than the printing press. And so, and it's going to be far more condensed, which is why living in 2020 and 21 and 22 feels like it does. Yeah. So it's just important to note. All right. So everyone should spend a lot of effort here, like we talked about, but we should also, feel God's embrace of grace here, because we are all adolescents when it comes to understanding this stuff. So it is a fight. We have to pay attention to how screens are changing the world and changing our children, because to not pay attention to this is to say, I will let my child be discipled by what's on the other side of the screen. And the people on the other side of the screen do not love your child. I'm not saying they hate your child. I'm not saying that they're wantonly disinterested in your child, but maybe they are trying to make money off our attention, and sometimes worse. So it is. We have to understand screens as the area of discipleship and formation. Okay, followers of Jesus need to be discipled by Jesus, not by their screens. And so this goes for parents and children. We need, if we are going to be discipled, we need patterns of healthy interaction. And so that just means we've got to figure out how to do limits on screens and use them properly. And every family, I think, is going to look plenty different in that. But every family who says, I follow Jesus, the one thing that's not going to look different is they've got to be asking, how are we using screens differently than the rest of the world?
Now, that's critical, because, in some cases, you've got screens more time on screens than interacting with parents. Just the math of that is not a good idea.
No,
it just isn't.
Yeah. That's where you see. I think you can see the true potential dangers here of the way it's possible now to start to form a life entirely on the screen. And you could talk about the effects of all the parenting you miss out on. You could talk about the warped relationships in the future. This is not going to go well for anybody. And that's where we, again, that love for children and care for them. Mr. Rogers is actually a wonderful example of this. In the way that he got into his job because he understood that television was going to reshape the world and he wanted to see it used well. And, we should think about, how can we love our children by helping them with screens? I try to remind parents of this. One of the greatest gifts you can give your child is to graduate them from the household knowing how to be a faithful follower of Jesus and a human being with integrity while on a screen. Because so much of the temptations of screens will be to have a private life there, will be to be hidden there, will be to develop unhealthy addictive habits there, will be to like turn off your attention and just let the screen take you where it wants to go. And there are literally life and death consequences to this. There are certainly ethical consequences to it. And I don't care whether they're talking about just being addicted to Netflix or pornography or just not having a friend because you only have online connections. But one of the most beautiful things that we'll do for our children is to shepherd them into the world where they say, screens are a wonderful and powerful thing that I know how to use well. Right. I mean, we need to think of that like alcohol, sex, money, or power. Like all can be good things if you learn how to use them right. All of them will destroy your life if no one teaches you how to use them right. And screens are that important. So I could talk about like, well, what are the specific things we do? And I get into that in the book and happy to go into it more. But anybody just needs to realize that the most important thing here is that you do something rather than nothing. You've got to figure out how to have some kind of rhythms of screens and healthy use. You can't just ignore it because the fight for formation, as Lauren puts it wonderfully, is worth it.
It really is. And, this is the value of the no's that we build into our rule. It's the careful boundaries that protect us from what could what could harm us.
That's right.
What could harm those we care for. That's why we say no at times alongside saying yes.
And when you understand, that's such an important idea, Alan. I'm glad you brought it up, because when you understand the glory that's on the other side of that no, the yes is to human presence. It's to learning how to be a person of prayer. It's to meal times. It's to last night, for example, my wife and I stood on the at the back door looking out onto the street where we recently put up a basketball hoop for the kids. And she was like, that basketball hoop has turned the street into a neighborhood, because there were all these kids playing on it with our sons, and it's 8:30 p.m. And they didn't ask us all day or all evening if they could watch a movie or play Nintendo Switch, which we do. We have rhythms for those things. Sure. But they were out there making friends with the neighbors and playing, and we could not convince them to go to bed or come inside. And it's like a small example, but we do live in a world now where you don't necessarily play basketball with the neighbors unless a helpful parent says, hey, Tuesday night is not screen time night. There are other nights for that, but it's not on Tuesday. So you need to go outside, or you need to sit down and eat, or you need to sit down and read. And that's human life. I mean, there's all these yeses on the other side of that no, but your children will be rewarded by bearing the more full image of God by all the things they say yes to, if you say no to the screens at the right times.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so as I think of your book, and I think of it from the vantage point of being kind of a spiritual director, the question I think that sometimes raises is, where do I start? Like maybe if I try to start establishing 10 habits in the next 2 days, I might get a little overwhelmed. Talk about how to approach a book like yours as a journey, as opposed to something to just land on the minute you've finished reading.
Absolutely. Yeah. I always tell people to start in community. So whether this is the community of your family and your spouse, which is probably the minimum requirement for rethinking habits of the household, need your spouse to be at least aware, if not on board. Right. But importantly, I mean, I definitely get parents saying, I really want to do this stuff, but my spouse doesn't, so that's important to acknowledge, as long as you want to be talking to them about it. But the community of your family is important. But if you can be reading this book or listening to this podcast with a friend, do it. If you can be reading this book or listening to this podcast with a small group, do it, because the most sticky habits are communal habits. And when you have a small group rethinking the habits of their household, you really got something to start with there. It's a lot different than reading a book or listening to this just while you do the dishes at night and then moving on to the next thing. So start in community. And then my second piece of advice to people is always to start small, as in start with one key change. So if you're doing it, let's say you just told your spouse, you've got to listen to this great podcast that Alan has. Got a guest, a little weird, but he's kind of worth listening to. If you send that to your spouse, and then you kind of want to say, what is one thing that we could try that would be different. And I recommend this because most people change incrementally. And if you try to do the New Year's resolutions of, you're losing 50 pounds this year and you're going to read 50 books. And we all know you're not going to do either of those things.
Right.
What you want to pick one thing. And I talk about keystone habits where sometimes one small thing changes lots of other things. So when I talk about personal life, I often talk about scripture before phone as a keystone habit.
So good.
There's a lot in the family rhythm, but you might say, all right, let's just try 3 times a week family dinner as a keystone habit. Or you might say, let's just try a bedtime liturgy as a keystone habit. There's a couple that you could pick, but you would say, let's try one of these things and practice it in this community of a family or a small group for a couple weeks and see what happens. So you start in community, you start small, and ideally you practice over a period of time to give a habit a chance of becoming a habit. It really, sometimes it's quick, but it's usually always a week or a couple before something becomes normal. And so, when you do that with somebody over a couple of weeks, the most amazing thing happens. Suddenly you just do the bedtime liturgy without thinking of it because you're just there. And that's the magic of habit. Now it's just a normal part of the family routine. And I have people who read the book or just, we talk about life and they're like, how do you do all these habits? And I was like, y'all, it is not impressive. It's just a habit. It's just kind of what we do every day. You've got them too. I mean, exactly anybody's house that we would walk into and for the first time, we'd be like, you do what? You do all these things, but that's just their normal. And again, back to our beginning, what we're trying to do is reframe our normal, and your normal can be beautiful. It really can. That's grace allows that. And it does take work, it does take effort, but you're not earning it. You're just following these motivations of grace and reframing the household. So while you start small, you start in community, there's a lot of things you can then add one habit at a time and really build a beautiful, beautiful household and a beautiful life out of small, tiny little brushstrokes.
Yeah, I think that's so good. Part of what I'm realizing as I listen to you is I'm not sure that everyone has how would I put it, like a formational way of thinking. A lot of times I think we think in terms of sequential events, like today I did all these things. Now tomorrow I'm going to do all those things. And then I'm going to do those things.
Yeah.
There's lots of disconnected things.
Yeah.
And you're talking about a kind of way of thinking where things connect.
Yes.
Like these habits become strengthened. And so, and in reality, that's how life actually works. But if we don't think that way, it's harder to cooperate with how things take shape in individual lives or in family communities.
That's right. Yeah. I think, and this, right? The trellis is often the, go-to metaphor for the rule of life or the life of habit. And I do think it's helpful. Like as you just said, Alan, your life is not a disparate set of tasks or actions that you took. You live and you grow on a trellis. There, you have a rule of life. You have a set of habits. The question is just, what does it look like? What is your rule of life? And that trellis is taking you places. I mean, you're a plant that is either growing into dangerous territory of strangling and twining and binding around other plants, and you're going to kill things, or you're growing and flourishing up a beautiful trellis. And so, thinking about how you build that trellis of habit, how you build it in your house, in your work, in your relationship with God, in your church, these are things that are really worth thinking about, and they're very possible to think about. But you do need to reframe into a formational mentality and realize that your habits are forming you far more than your hopes. In many cases, you need to align them to really have the full kind of flourishing of a disciple of Jesus.
Yeah. I'm thinking of this story. I'm going to try and tell it really briefly. We moved in the house we live in now almost, 24 years ago. We moved in. There were a bunch of these little wisteria vines growing all over the backyard, just these little twirly looking things. And they would grow and nothing would happen to them, except one of them found a 4x4 of our deck.
Yes.
Ran itself up it. And by the time about 15 years had gone, the base of that thing was the size of an anaconda.
Yes.
And the entire patio of hundreds of square feet of coverage were completely shaded by this single little wisteria vine, which to me is
it.
The image of a formation.
That is
How in
it.
the world do you create a anaconda-sized wisteria plant? Well, it's a trellis. It takes time.
Just let it grow.
But you got to have a place to grow.
Yes. And, and it's such a helpful reminder that, something is going to grow. And in this case, hopefully it's something beautiful that covers and becomes very strong. But if it was a weed or if it was something dangerous, it could take down the deck, right? Like if little things that are harmful also grow. And that's where you just want to remind yourself that you need to pay attention to the vines that are growing and cultivate the right ones and work on releasing and, letting go of the wrong ones, because things grow and formation is the reality of our lives.
That's exactly right. Well, as we come to the close of our conversation, Justin, I wonder if I could just ask you to offer a word of encouragement, kind of in the spirit of what you've written, that might help our listeners take a next step.
Yeah. I think I'd like to say, listen, there's so many ways to go, but for some reason, hopefully the Holy Spirit's prompting. I'm thinking that, it's possible for people to hear conversations about habits as essentially relevant to type A people who want to, form tasks lists and get things done and really do it right. And somebody listening is, of the more artistic kind or spontaneous kind and just thinking, isn't this oppressive or in some way? And I really want to care about the bedtime routine I have tomorrow, not just, do a liturgy I've done every day. And I just want to encourage, whether you're type A and you're like, I'm doing this, or whether you're like, I don't know about all this. I just want to encourage you that this is a lot more art than science. And it is a lot more beauty than rote memory. I think the most beautiful paintings, are labored over stroke by stroke, and they're built of tiny, tiny little efforts that amount to enormous and enduring masterpieces. Yeah. And I think we need to take habit out of the realm of productivity and type A-ness, because that is, by the way, just not my life. And so just know that the person talking about this doesn't think like this. We need to take it out of that realm and put it into the realm of, we're trying to create beautiful lives, because that is the call to live in light of the gospel, is a call to a grand project of sanctification in becoming more like Christ. We are his masterpieces, right? Created in him to do good works. And I think that these habits need to be seen as just small little brushstrokes in an endeavor to paint a beautiful life. So if this feels onerous to you, then we've said something wrong, or maybe you need to listen again and drop some of the presuppositions. One or the two could be happening, but rethink it and listen again, and see if you don't see that this is really a project to live into the beautiful masterpiece that God has made you to be.
Yeah, I love that image, the idea of a beautiful masterpiece. I love the language of invitation. I really do think you've extended to us a kind of divine invitation to join in God's formational intention. He really does want to help us change into who we dream of being and who he intends us to be. Yes. So again, my guest has been Justin Whitmel Earley, and we've been talking about his book, Habits of the Household. Justin, it's been such a pleasure to have this conversation.
Indeed. I hope we can do it again sometime, Alan. Thank you so much. I
always enjoy it. I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. There really is freedom in the cultivating of holy habits. People are creatures of habit, literally. We have habits of schedule, habits of thinking, habits of attitude, habits of how we interact with others. The great gift of what Justin has written here is to explore the possibility of choosing habits that reflect the life we really want to live, the life to which Jesus invites us. And that is a great gift. In the next few episodes, we'll be talking with authors Todd Hall and Ruth Haley Barton. We'll also have conversations with leaders just like you about how leadership and control are not the same thing, and how true joy energizes great leadership. I can't wait to share those with you. Now, if you'd like to receive more help from Unhurried Living, I invite you to join our Unhurried daily email list. For 40 days, we'll send you a brief daily email that offers personal reflections from life and Scripture to help you take the next step in following Jesus' unhurried way. You can sign up on our website at unhurriedliving.com. We're honored to encourage thousands of leaders just like you. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join me next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.